The old soldier lived alone for 20 years, until a disabled dog walked into his life, not to be saved, but to save him. One man, one dog, and an invisible bond forged through memories of war, long-held silence, and once again, loyalty. But the most unexpected part wasn't how they met. It was how that dog carried out his final mission when no one else could. If you believe that every creature has a reason for crossing our path, support us by hitting subscribe to Dog Stories, where we share real, heartfelt stories that speak to the deepest part of the soul. Because some stories stay with you forever, even after just one listen. It all started on a quiet autumn morning, and a look that said everything, without a single word. Late autumn in Montana carried a slow, sinking cold, like winter was standing just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to slip in through coat sleeves and cracks in the door. Damp yellow leaves were scattered across the road into town, curling into lazy spirals each time the wind passed through. Along a narrow road cutting through the pine forest, an old silver pickup rolled to a stop in front of a small iron gate. The wooden sign above it, faded by years of snow and rain, read, "Silver Creek Shelter." Walter Briggs sat behind the wheel for a few more seconds before turning off the engine. He wasn't in a hurry. He hadn't been in years. His weathered army jacket clung to his broad, stiff shoulders like a piece of memory that never left. His right hand, sun-darkened and calloused, tightened around the door handle before pushing it open. He hadn't come to adopt. Just stop by, his counselor at the VA had said. Gentle, not pushy. Not to change anything, just to see what's still there. Walter didn't respond, just like he lived, quietly, steadily, far from anything loud or fast. Silver Creek Shelter was small and modest, tucked behind a row of tall pine trees. Inside, the warmth from the heaters clashed with the biting air outside, but the smell of bleach and wet fur made Walter move slowly, like he needed a moment to adjust, to breathe in a space that wasn't his. A young staffer with a high braid and a hoodie bearing the shelter's logo smiled politely. "Can I help you with something, sir?" Walter shook his head, his voice low, barely audible. "Just looking." "Take your time," she said, pointing toward the row of kennels to the left. "This hallway here, they're all up to date on their shots." He gave a small nod, hands still tucked in his coat pockets. His footsteps echoed softly along the cold tile hallway, where barking, cage scratching, and heavy breathing wove together into a kind of symphony, one composed by lives waiting for someone to notice. Walter said nothing. He didn't linger on any of the dogs trying to catch his eye. A Labrador jumped up as he passed. A husky let out a low, mournful howl like it had a story to tell. But his gaze remained distant, not out of indifference, but because he was far too familiar with the shape of loss. It was like walking through a dream that didn't belong to him. His feet stopped near the end of the hall, where the light grew dim and didn't quite reach the corners. One kennel sat tucked away, silent, no barking, no frantic movement, just a quiet presence, like the animal inside had long accepted being overlooked. Walter didn't know why he stopped there. Maybe it was unconscious, or maybe it was an old instinct, the kind that once helped him survive in places maps never bothered to name. His eyes narrowed, head tilted slightly forward, but he didn't step closer, not yet. A light breeze slipped through the door before it slammed shut behind him. The sound made the other dogs bark louder, stir more, but Walter didn't look back. His eyes stayed fixed on that shadowed corner, not where dogs waited for owners, but where something waited that had once had one. Something that once had a job. His hands tightened in his pockets. A quiet breath slipped through his teeth. Then, slowly, he took one step forward. Just one. The rest, he wasn't ready to name yet. Walter stopped. Just one more step and he'd reach the end of the hallway, where the flickering fluorescent lights no longer cast their full glow. The air in that corner felt different, still heavy, like the entire shelter had unconsciously paused to take a slower breath. He squinted, peering into the dimness. A metal kennel sat tucked far into the corner. No barking, no movement, no attempt to draw attention. And maybe that's exactly why he noticed it. Inside, a German shepherd lay on his side, head resting flat against the floor, his large frame taking up most of the kennel space. His fur was a dark, mottled gray, patchy in places like echoes of harder days. One hind leg was curled and awkwardly, trembling in small pulses even though the rest of his body hardly moved. Walter didn't say a word. He just stood there, silent, his pale gray eyes staring through the rusted metal bars. And then the dog lifted his head, slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the act itself cost more energy than he cared to spend. But when the dog's gaze met Walter's, everything else seemed to fade. No more barking, no more footsteps, no more clanging of kennel doors. Just two pairs of eyes, one belonging to a man who had lost faith in connection, and the other to something that had once been left behind. They didn't blink, no nod, no whisper, but something passed between them. One recognized the other, one understood the other. No records needed, no backstory required. The small tag hanging from the kennel bars told Walter the dog's name, Duke. Age about 9, sex, male. A note underneath, written in faded blue ink, read, "Not recommended for adoption. Retired canine, leg injury, slow response." Walter knelt, not out of emotion, and not because he needed a closer look, just because at that level there was nothing between him and Duke's eyes. Duke shifted slightly, just a few inches forward, as if to come closer, but stopped short, maintaining a safe distance. The kind of posture that comes from service, from training, from sacrifice, and from being left behind. Walter didn't need to ask. He had seen those eyes before, in the mirror, in VA hospitals, in the faces of soldiers who came home with parts of themselves missing. A soft footstep behind him broke the silence. The young staffer from earlier stood a few feet back, watching quietly. "You're looking at Duke?" she asked softly, like she didn't want to break whatever was happening. He usually doesn't get up when people walk by. Walter didn't take his eyes off Duke. He was canine? Yes. Search and rescue, specially trained, worked in landslides and wildfires. One time, during a missing person mission, his leg got caught on a piece of broken metal, tore the muscle. He had surgery, but never fully recovered. She paused for a moment, then added, "At his age, with that kind of injury, most people don't want to take him in. It makes sense, I guess." Walter didn't answer. Duke didn't move either. But that gaze, the one that hadn't left him since the beginning, still burned softly, like an ember that refused to die out. "No one wants a broken dog," the girl said quietly, "unless they know what it's like to be broken too." Walter looked at her for the first time. Just a brief glance, no thanks, no resentment, then turned back to Duke. "Can I take him for a walk?" he asked. She looked a bit surprised, but quickly nodded. "Of course. I'll grab his leash for you." As she walked away, Walter stood up slowly. Duke watched him the whole time, no bark, no sudden movement, but his tail gave a faint wag, just once. Whether it was joy, memory, or something older and deeper, Walter couldn't tell. Walter Briggs hadn't come to Silver Creek looking for anything, but he found a pair of eyes that didn't ask why, only said, "I'm still here. Are you?" The leash was clipped onto Duke's collar with a quiet patience shared by both sides. The young staffer kept her voice soft, as if afraid to disturb the fragile connection just forming between the man and the dog. But Walter didn't need instruction. The moment his hand took the leash, Duke stood, slowly but steady, and was ready to move. The iron door creaked open, its hinges groaning gently. Duke stepped through as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. No excitement, no hesitation, just a step forward, into a wider world, but with the same quiet discipline of a soldier. The hallway seemed narrower as they passed the other dogs still barking and pawing at their gates. But Duke didn't turn his head. His eyes stayed forward, his pace even. No commands were given, yet he moved like he was following orders from someone he still remembered. The small stone-paved yard behind the shelter, with a few flower beds fading out with the season, became their first testing ground. Walter said nothing. He loosened the leash and walked forward slowly. Duke followed like a shadow, no tugging, no hesitation. When Walter stopped, Duke stopped. When he turned left, Duke tilted his head slightly. And when Walter raised his right hand palm down, lowering it just a bit, the old signal for sit, Duke lowered himself gently, eyes locked on Walter the entire time. No words were spoken. But the message was clear. And somehow, Duke still remembered. Walter tried again, this time with his left hand open, then closing into a fist, the signal to stay. Duke stood, his injured leg trembling slightly, but he didn't move. Only his tail gave a small wag, like a signal from deep inside. "I'm still ready." A minute passed, then 2. Walter tried a few more gestures, all familiar, all met with response. Not perfect, but clear. The kind of clarity that only comes from those trained not to wag for attention, but to walk into places no one else dared. Walter leaned down and gently placed a hand on Duke's head. The fur was coarse, a little dry, but warm. Duke didn't flinch, didn't lean in, he just stood there and accepted it. A thought passed through Walter's mind, not from a book, not something someone once said. This dog wasn't broken, he was waiting. Waiting for a command, a leader, a reason to serve again, just like him. The staffer watched from a distance, a hint of surprise on her face. Not because Duke followed commands, but because something in Walter had shifted, almost without him realizing it. His posture was straighter, his steps slower but more certain, and his eyes, they no longer looked so far away. "I've never seen him like that before," she said as Walter turned back toward the door. "Like what?" he asked. "Like he's doing what he was meant to do." Walter looked at Duke, now standing calmly at his side as if that spot had always belonged to him. "Maybe it's because we both used to do it." She nodded, then hesitated. "If you'd like, I can start the adoption paperwork. No pressure, though." Walter cut her off with a quiet nod. "Go ahead." "You sure?" she asked, a little taken aback. "Not out of pity," he said, eyes still on Duke. "I didn't save him, and he didn't save me, but we understand each other, and I'm tired of being quiet by myself." Duke gently nudged Walter's hand, not forceful, not needy. Just a touch of acknowledgement. And just like that, no fanfare, no trumpet, no stack of paperwork, a new kind of partnership began. Not between man and dog, but between two who once had roles, had missions, and were told they were no longer needed. Walter Briggs' cabin sat far from the rest of the world, tucked deep in the pine woods outside Livingston, Montana, where cell signals flickered in and out and winter arrived early and stayed longer than it should. The small wooden house had one floor, a sloped roof, a wood-burning stove, and two windows that faced the forest, where the sun rarely stayed more than a few quiet hours each day. Duke sat quietly in the passenger seat of the pickup truck the entire ride home. No barking, no anxious glances. Just his eyes, always fixed on Walter, as if he still couldn't believe this trip was real, that the silent old man beside him was the one who had chosen him, not the other way around. When the door opened, Duke jumped down, slowly, his back leg slightly off, but he didn't need help. Walter opened the cabin door and stepped inside first. No calling, no signals. Duke followed like it was second nature. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, damp proofing, and long-sitting coffee. The floor was cold, the wood stove unlit, the light dim, but Duke didn't complain. He simply made a quiet loop around the space, cautious, deliberate, marking nothing, just taking it all in. Not claiming territory, just recognizing and respecting it. Walter tossed his coat onto the hook, walked straight into the kitchen, lit the gas stove, and started cooking some ground beef with vegetables. Duke lay down near the wood stove, no whining, no begging. But as the smell of food began to fill the room, his droopy ears twitched slightly. "You eat beef, don't you?" Walter muttered, almost like talking to the air. Duke just watched. No response. But the way he sat up and leaned ever so slightly toward the scent was answer enough. Their first dinner passed in silence. Walter set the bowl on the floor. Duke ate slowly, not scarfing it down like a shelter dog used to fighting for scraps. There was something disciplined about it, as if he were still performing a soldier's ritual, even though no superior was left to inspect him. After dinner, Walter lit the wood stove. The fire slowly warmed the room, casting a soft golden glow across the old wooden floor. Duke lay on his side nearby, head resting on his front paws, eyes half closed. That image, quiet, unforced, made the cabin feel just a little bigger, like Walter wasn't completely alone anymore. He settled into his armchair, a cup of black tea in hand. His eyes drifted toward the window. Beyond it, the woods were dark, the wind rustling dry leaves across the ground. "They sent us to Bosnia during winter, '95. It was so cold, the blood in the syringes froze before we could even use them." For the first time, Walter spoke about the battlefield without being asked. And the one listening just lay there. No judgment, no interruptions. "There was a young kid on our team. Name was Travis. Always talked about opening a repair shop when he got back. Every time we were in the bunker, he'd tell stories about the '68 Mustang he rebuilt with his dad. I hated hearing it over and over, but..." Walter paused. His hand tightened slightly around the cup. Duke opened his eyes, lifted his head, locked onto him. Travis was the only one who didn't make it back. A slow breath, no tears, no dramatics. Just a piece of memory brought into the light for the first time in years. Duke stood, walked over, not begging, not pushing. He simply sat beside him, gently resting his head against Walter's knee. Walter looked down. He didn't smile. But his hand rested lightly on Duke's back. A small gesture, just enough to make the fire no longer the only thing keeping the cabin warm. Mornings in Montana came slower in winter. The first light of day stretched thin along the edge of the forest, quietly brushing against the mist-covered pines. Walter was usually up before the sun, and now so was Duke. He lay by the door, posture alert, not eager, not expecting a reward, just present. As if the day couldn't truly begin until his commander was ready to give the order. Walter strapped on an old watch, no longer accurate, but still part of a routine that had once been non-negotiable. He pulled on his coat and opened the back door of the cabin. The morning air was dry, the ground stiff beneath a thin layer of frost, easier to walk than usual. He looked out toward the clearing, once just a patch of wild dirt in the woods. But over the past few days, he'd rebuilt something out there, something familiar. A makeshift training ground. No fences, no signs. Just a few homemade obstacles, a low wooden ladder, a PVC jump ring, some marker poles with red flags. Simple, makeshift, but enough to awaken something both he and Duke thought had long gone quiet. "Ready," Walter said softly without looking down. Duke stood, still limping, his left hind leg slightly off, but his eyes were brighter than they had been in days. No leash, no tugging, just a hand signal, palm down, a slight wave, and Duke dropped into a down position immediately. Walter took a few steps forward, raised his hand into a closed fist, the signal to hold. Duke didn't move. Next command, go. Duke launched forward, not fast but steady. He weaved around the flags, climbed over the low wood step. His body no longer moved with the grace it once had, but each motion spoke clearly. The memory was still there. Walter didn't smile, he didn't praise, but there was a look, barely there, the kind only seen in those who've lost everything and dared to hope again. A quiet, small kind of hope. Every morning they kept at it. New commands, new obstacles. Walter added a crossbar for Duke to jump over. He didn't leap, just stepped across. But his eyes stayed locked, steady. "Not for competition," Walter said one afternoon when Duke hesitated in the middle of the ring, "just to remember how to serve." And Duke understood that. One day, Walter introduced something new. A small cloth pouch filled with an object carrying a distinct scent like a handkerchief. He hid it behind a log. "Seek," he commanded. It took Duke a few beats, but then his head dropped low, nose sweeping along the ground, and like something instinctual reawakened, he found it. When he returned, limping, the pouch held gently in his mouth, he placed it at Walter's feet and sat, waiting for the next command. Walter looked at him for a long moment. "Still got it, soldier," he murmured. At night, Walter began writing things down by hand, something he hadn't done since leaving the military. Day 8, Duke remembers about 80% of old commands. Gait still weak, but response clear. Faster reaction time than a fresh recruit. Stable temperament, no fear, no negative response to loud noises. After each entry, he'd sit a little longer by the fire. Duke lay nearby. They didn't need to speak. Presence was enough. But somewhere, whether in Duke's eyes or in Walter's relentless retraining, there was something that wasn't just nostalgia. It wasn't about passing time. It wasn't about making Duke feel useful again. It felt more like preparation. Preparation for something that hadn't happened, or maybe something Walter knew inevitably would. He installed a makeshift warning bell behind the cabin, wired it himself to a wooden post. There wasn't a clear reason. When a neighbor asked, he simply said, "I'd rather be warned early than late." Sometimes Duke would just sit and watch as Walter worked on these things, not joining in, not resisting. But every time Walter stepped onto the training ground, Duke followed. No call, no leash, no reason needed, just a flick of the hand, and he'd return to his familiar position. Amid the bitter cold of winter and the unwavering rows of pine, two old soldiers trained as if the next mission could come at any moment. The Montana sky was washed in pale gray that morning, not raining, just casting that cold, even light that turned everything to lead. The bare tree trunks, the rough stones along the trail, Walter and Duke had walked together all winter long. Walter zipped his coat back up and glanced at Duke, who was walking steadily ahead, his back leg still slightly uneven, but persistent. They hadn't needed a leash in a long time. Just a hand signal, a glance, that was enough. The trail stretched out from behind the cabin, winding along the hillside, then curling into the forest, so still that if you stopped, you could hear your own breathing. Walter paused at a bend, stepping over a fallen tree blocking the path. And in that exact moment, the ground gave way beneath him. No warning, no time to react. Just a sudden drop, his body falling like a stone into a well. "God damn it," Walter growled in his mind just before the impact. Hard, sharp, echoed as he hit the bottom. The breath was knocked out of his chest. Then came the pain, sharp, immediate, blinding, slicing through everything. He lay on his side, face pressed into damp earth and cold moss. The pain in his leg was dizzying. Trying to sit up, he looked down at his pant leg, bent at the wrong angle, and the burning sensation running down his left shin confirmed what he didn't want to admit. Broken. "Duke!" Walter tried to call out. The sound came out weak, hoarse. Above him, light poured through the mouth of the hole, nearly 3 meters up, and then the familiar face appeared. Duke, panting hard, peering down with alert, watchful eyes. "Stay," Walter signaled with his hand. Then he reached into his coat pocket for his phone. No signal. Of course, he looked up, trying to stay conscious. "Listen to me, boy." His voice was broken, strained. "Go home. Get help." Duke didn't move, didn't flinch. His eyes locked on Walter. Walter raised his hand, slow but firm, the old signal. "Return." Duke let out a low growl in his throat like he was arguing. "Go," Walter said louder. "Soldier, that's an order." They stared at each other. 1 beat, 2. Then Duke turned, but after just a few steps, he stopped, looked back. Walter panted, struggling to keep his eyes open. "You have to go." Duke stared at him for a long moment, as if memorizing the image, as if he knew this mission might be the last, and then he ran. He didn't look back. By the time Duke left the forest, the sky had turned to solid gray. He pushed forward on instinct. Every scent of tree bark, every jutting rock, every patch of strange grass became data to navigate. Each leap, each landing sent pain shooting up his injured leg, but Duke didn't stop. He didn't know the time, didn't need a compass. He just knew he had to get home. The cabin appeared at the edge of the woods, low roof, no smoke rising from the chimney. Duke ran straight to the door, barking loud, but no one answered. Walter lived alone, he always had. Duke turned toward the house farther down the road where every morning an older woman rode her bike past. Walter's neighbor, always waving hello. He bolted again, mouth open, panting hard, but he didn't stop. At the fence he barked, loud, sharp, insistent. The door swung open. "Duke," the woman called out, surprised. "What is it, boy?" Duke let out a growl, then turned and ran. After a few strides he stopped, looked back, barked again. The woman frowned. "Where is he? Where's Walter?" Duke ran again. Stopped, looked, then kept going. She didn't understand everything, but she understood enough to follow. Her husband joined her moments later. They threw on coats, crossed the frost-covered field, and followed Duke. Local police arrived 15 minutes later. EMTs followed close behind, carrying a stretcher, flashlights, and pain meds. Duke led the way, panting harder with each step, his left leg shaking uncontrollably. He wouldn't let anyone carry him. He wouldn't stop. He just kept going, until the hole came into view. Then, he dropped to the ground. Walter lay below, pale, cold sweat gathering on his forehead. "Still here," he rasped, forcing a smile. "Save your breath, sir," one of the rescue workers said gently. As they stabilized his leg and began lifting him out, Duke stayed put. No whining, no tail wagging, no frantic movement. He just watched and held his post, like some kind of training exercise was still underway. Walter was placed onto the stretcher. As they passed Duke, he raised his hand, weak but steady, and touched the dog's head. "Mission complete," he whispered. Duke lifted his head, pressing his nose to Walter's hand. No training required, no command given, just one comrade acknowledging another. The news spread faster than anyone expected, and no one could quite explain why it caught fire. Maybe it was the cell phone video from the neighbor, Duke leading the way, limping, panting, but eyes locked straight ahead. Or maybe it was the medic's quiet quote. If that dog had been 30 minutes later, he would have bled out. Whatever it was, within 3 days, the entire small town of Livingston knew the name Duke. No longer just Briggs' old dog or that limping shepherd. He was now Duke, the retired K-9 who returned for one last mission. The story first appeared in a small column of the local paper, alongside a grainy photo, Walter lying on the stretcher, his hand resting on Duke's head. The headline read, "Old Soldier Saved by Old Dog, Brotherhood Doesn't Age." The next day, the article was shared by a veterans group on social media. By day 5, Walter was lying in a hospital bed when a nurse walked in holding an iPad and said, "They're saying you made the national news." Walter just shook his head slightly. He didn't care for the spotlight. But when the nurse turned the screen to show a photo of Duke, sitting on the cabin porch, head lifted, light falling across his face, Walter allowed himself a faint smile. "He hasn't changed a bit," he murmured. When Walter was discharged and returned home, he didn't walk straight into the cabin. He stopped at the porch. Duke was there, in his usual spot, head resting between his front paws, eyes half closed like always. But when he heard the footsteps, he looked up. He didn't get up, didn't move. He just wagged his tail once, just enough to confirm the commander had come home. Walter sat down beside him. No words, no hugs. Just reached out, rested his hand on Duke's neck, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. "They're calling you a hero," Walter said quietly. Duke didn't react. He didn't need to. Walter looked out toward the woods, where just weeks ago he thought his story would end. "I told them, you're not a dog, you're a teammate, a brother." A week later, the town held a small ceremony at the central square. Flags were raised, a row of chairs faced the stage. Walter arrived late, sat in the back row, leaning on a wooden cane, wearing a well-worn baseball cap. Duke lay beside him, no leash, no muzzle. But everyone there knew he didn't need to be held back. Duke's presence alone was enough to keep the kids still and the adults respectful. A police officer gave a short speech about courage, loyalty, and an unwavering spirit of service. A third-grade student read a small poem about Duke, including the line, "He walks with a limp, but never behind." When it came time for the medal ceremony, a representative from the K-9 Honor Foundation stepped forward. In his hand was a custom-made medal for Duke, engraved with the words, "For courage beyond duty, companion of valor." Duke's name was called. There was no barking, no need for a stage entrance. Walter simply gave a small nod, and Duke rose, slowly but steady, and walked to the presenter's side. They placed the medal around his neck, gently, without fanfare. He stood still, calm eyes, ears alert. He didn't understand why people clapped, didn't know why some of them cried. But Duke understood one thing. His commander was sitting in the back row, and he was still on duty. After the ceremony, a young reporter from a local TV station approached Walter. "Can you tell us something about Duke? Why do you think he came back for you?" Walter looked at her, his eyes heavy with time. Then he glanced at Duke, now resting his head on Walter's knee, calm as always. "Because he's not just a dog," Walter said. "He's my brother." In the days that followed, Duke's story continued to spread. They made t-shirts with his picture. Kids drew him in crayon. Elders brought folding chairs to Walter's porch, asking him to tell the legend. Walter rarely told it, but once, a young boy asked, "Mister, do you think Duke knows he's a hero?" Walter ruffled the boy's hair and nodded toward Duke, asleep at his feet. "He doesn't need to know," he said. "He just needs to know. I'm still alive." Spring in Montana often arrived without warning. Not with sunshine, but with the sound of melting snow dripping from rooftops, the faint scent of damp earth in the air, and the call of owls echoing from deep in the forest. That night was as quiet as any other. Walter's small wooden cabin sat wrapped in darkness, the fire in the stove long since faded, leaving only a faint orange glow flickering on the floorboards. Duke lay near the door, breathing steady, his head resting beside Walter's worn combat boots, the same spot he'd claimed for months. Walter slept in his armchair, a thin blanket draped over him. The room felt frozen in time. No movement, no ticking clock. Until Duke suddenly shot upright. It wasn't quite a jolt, his body was too old for that. But the way Duke lifted himself, ears perked, shifting from stillness to alert in a breath, it was pure service instinct. His eyes locked on the left window, where a sound had come, barely audible, like metal brushing glass. Duke let out a single bark, sharp, short, no follow-up. Then he turned to look at Walter. Walter startled awake, old instincts still wired deep. He sat up straight, hand gripping the cane beside his chair. "What is it, boy?" Duke didn't respond, just barked twice, clear, sharp. Then he ran to the front door. Walter got to his feet and stepped onto the porch. Nothing unusual in the woods. But off in the distance, across the dirt road, the house belonging to the elderly Keller couple had a shadow slipping along the side wall. Walter froze. Damn it. No lights. No alarms. Just Duke, barking loud, sharp, the only alarm this part of the woods had. And he didn't stop. Each bark came stronger, tighter, more deliberate. The sound cut through the trees, echoing into the dark, waking neighbors. Lights began flipping on, one house after another. A door opened, then another. A figure bolted from the Keller's house, but it was too late. A young man, wearing a backpack, stumbling through the dirt, was intercepted by two nearby neighbors. He struggled, but one hard whack to the knee with a flashlight dropped him to the ground. Police arrived 10 minutes later. The thief was cuffed and hauled into the back of the cruiser, cursing under his breath the whole way. Mr. Keller, still trembling, recounted the moment. "I had just woken up and saw someone at the back door. If it weren't for that dog," the officer nodded. "What dog?" Walter, now standing on the porch with Duke lying at his feet, breathing heavily, simply nodded toward him. "That one." The officer looked down at Duke, old, tired, chest heaving, but eyes sharp, ears still tracking every sound. "That's Duke?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Walter gave a faint smirk. "Still him." The next morning, the sun hadn't fully risen, but people were already gathering, bringing flowers, baked goods, placing them at the gate of the cabin. Someone taped a hand-painted sign to the fence. "Protected by Duke, hero of the hollow." The town paper had another headline to run. "Duke, the dog who saved twice." Walter didn't go out much, but that morning he sat on the porch, a mug of hot coffee in his hands. Duke lay beside him, head resting on Walter's leg like always. Only this time, Walter could feel something was different. Duke's breathing was heavier, not fast, but deep, strained. Each bark from the night before had clearly cost him, drawing from reserves he'd been rationing day by day. Walter knew. He didn't say it, he just placed a hand on Duke's back, stroking gently. "You did it again," he whispered, "but this time, it took a little more, didn't it?" Duke didn't move, but his tail gave one small wag. When the visitors were gone, Walter closed the door and rekindled the fire. He poured water into Duke's old ceramic bowl. Duke didn't drink. He just lay there, head still angled toward the door, like he was waiting for the next command. Walter sat down on the floor beside him. In silence, not to stand guard, but to keep him company. The battle last night had no gunfire, no blood. But for Duke, it was a soldier's final mission. And Walter understood, deep down, that this was what had drained him more than any fall in the woods ever could. That morning was quieter than most. Snow had fallen overnight, layering the porch in a thin white sheet, dusting the old pine branches surrounding the cabin. Inside, the fire still burned in the stove, quietly warming a corner of the weathered wooden room. The smell of smoke and coffee lingered in the air. A familiar scent, the kind that made it feel like today would be just like any other. Walter rose early, as always. A soldier's instincts didn't allow for sleeping in. He pushed himself up from the armchair, draped the blanket over his shoulders, and moved slowly toward the kitchen to boil water. Duke was still there, his usual spot, between the fire and Walter's boots. His head rested gently against one boot, ears folded back, eyes closed. The posture was no different from any other morning, calm, relaxed, exactly in place, like a soldier taking a short rest during a long watch. Walter didn't notice right away. He poured his coffee, cracked the window open, and looked out at the woods. Snow still drifted softly. The air was crisp but carried a peaceful kind of beauty. It wasn't until he turned back that he noticed. Duke hadn't stirred. No heavy breathing, no faint tail wag at the sound of footsteps, no lazy sideways glance like he always gave. Walter stood still, one beat. Then he stepped closer and sat down, placed his hand on Duke's back. Cold, but not freezing, just missing warmth. Walter said nothing, didn't call his name, didn't speak. He just sat there, his hand resting on Duke's back, unmoving. He looked down at the familiar face, the folded ears, the graying fur above the eyes, the snout that used to nudge his hand every morning. There was no twitch, no final breath. Duke had left the way he lived beside him, quietly, in place, without causing a stir. Walter tilted his head toward the fire. The flames still burned, casting a warm glow across his face and Duke's motionless body. Everything else remained the same. The soft crackle of wood, the lingering smell of coffee in the air, everything except one beat. One life. One breath. And he felt empty. Not like the pain of war. Not like the violent loss of a fellow soldier. This was a quieter kind of grief, deeper, like someone had taken a piece of memory he hadn't gotten the chance to hold on to. Walter didn't cry, not because he was tough, but because in that moment he couldn't bring himself to disturb Duke's peace with the sound of a sob. The dog had completed every mission. There was nothing left to say. The fire in the stove kept burning, the crackle of wood like a ticking biological clock, still going, while time itself seemed to stall inside the small cabin. By noon, the sky cleared slightly. Walter bundled up in a thick coat, wrapped a wool scarf around his neck, and stepped out behind the cabin, to the small patch of land they'd once used as a training yard. The large pine tree near the edge of the woods. That's where he chose. It was where Duke had once waited for orders. Where he ran slow but steady laps around the flags, stepped over wooden beams, searched for the scent on an old handkerchief Walter had hidden. It was the place where words were unnecessary, but purpose was understood. Walter dug with an old shovel. The ground was hard, a thin layer of snow across it, but he didn't rush. Each scoop of earth came with a breath, a memory. When the grave was deep enough, he went back inside, wrapped Duke in the old fleece blanket, the one he always slept on at night. No funeral cloth, no flowers. He carried him out, not with strength but with respect, laid him down gently, covered him slowly, no sobbing, no cries, only the wind moving through the trees like a solemn farewell. By late afternoon, Walter placed a small wooden marker in the soil, hand-carved. The letters uneven but clear. Duke, soldier, guardian, friend. He pressed it into the earth at the head of the grave, stepped back a few paces, looked, then sat on the stone bench he'd placed there the summer before. There was no ceremony, no one came, but Walter knew there didn't need to be a crowd, because what Duke had done was already a full life, a life of meaning. The late sun cut sideways through the trees, casting light across the new wooden marker. The wind carried the scent of dry pine and melting frost. Walter sat there for a long time, hands clasped, eyes fixed and unblinking. "I'm not crying, kid," he muttered, "not quite to anyone. You don't need tears." Duke didn't fall in battle. He didn't go down after a mission. He simply chose a night to lie down in the right position, in the right place, and leave like a retired soldier. No complaints, no send-off needed. That night, the cabin was still warm. Walter still cooked dinner, still sat in his armchair, still poured coffee into the old enamel mug. But the water bowl by the door wasn't refilled, and there were no more paw steps on the floor when he stood. Only silence, and an empty space, undeniable, yet deeply peaceful. Spring returned faster than Walter expected. The snow melted back into the ground, leaving a trail of damp mud along the path behind the cabin. New pine shoots began to sprout, and the forest came alive with the quiet sounds of something waking up. Dripping water, soft wind, and the comfortable silence of a place at peace. Walter kept his routine. Up early, brewed coffee, stood on the porch for a few minutes before starting the day. The only difference was the empty space at his feet, the spot where Duke used to lie. Now it was just an old rug, left untouched, still in place. One morning in late March, as the sun warmed the porch just enough to soften the wood, a silver-gray car pulled up outside the gate. The person who stepped out was Maya, manager of the Silver Creek shelter, the young woman who'd first brought Duke to him. She wasn't alone. Beside her was a puppy. Small but not tiny, with a pudgy frame, shaggy gray-brown fur, and ears that drooped like they hadn't quite gotten used to the wind. His paws were far too big for his body, awkward on the uneven ground, and his eyes were uncertain, part cautious, part curious, like he was ready to run, yet also waiting for someone to speak first. Walter sat on the wooden porch bench, still holding his coffee. He looked at Maya, then at the puppy, said nothing. "I know you didn't call," Maya said softly. "But we thought maybe you'd want to meet this little guy." Walter raised an eyebrow. The puppy took a slow step toward him, not too close, but not turning away either. He stopped at the edge of the porch, sat down, head tilted slightly as if weighing his options. Walter watched him for a long moment, not to compare, not to replace, just to see if there was something, anything, left in that uncertain gaze that might be enough to begin a new bond. And then he smiled, a small smile, but a real one. "You've got big paws to fill, kid." The puppy didn't understand, but he wagged his tail, awkward, short, uneven. But he wagged. Walter set his coffee down, stood, walked over, and sat beside the pup. He didn't reach out right away. He just waited. And after a few seconds, the little guy took one more step, pressed his nose to Walter's hand, quickly, then pulled back. An incomplete gesture, but a beginning. Walter looked over at Maya and gave a small nod. No paperwork. No signatures. Just that nod, enough to let the circle begin again. He scooped the pup up with both hands, light, squirming, unsure, and stepped out onto the porch. By then, the sun had risen just high enough to cast light through the tall pine behind the cabin. At its base, the wooden marker still stood. Duke, soldier, guardian, friend. Walter paused for a few seconds, eyes resting on that spot. He said nothing. But anyone who saw that moment would understand. The pain hadn't vanished. It had simply taken on a new shape, smaller, clumsier, and waiting to be taught how to walk on the left, like a proper soldier. Some wounds don't need healing, just someone willing to stay while we learn how to live with them. Duke had done that. And now, it was the puppy's turn to learn in his own way. No one replaces anyone. But love, once etched into the rhythm of early mornings, the crackle of fire, or a silhouette on the porch, always finds its way back. Sometimes it starts with a strange pair of eyes, sometimes with paws that are too big, and ears that haven't yet learned the sound of their own name. Duke didn't live forever, but his story just might. Because not everyone gets a four-legged friend willing to limp through a forest, push through pain, and come back to save them. And not everyone is lucky enough to find a bond, silent, loyal, and devoted until the very last breath. Walter didn't need to replace Duke. He just needed a reason to open the door each morning, to keep the warmth circling the porch a little longer. And sometimes, that all begins with a wobbly little dog, whose heart is ready to learn how to walk beside someone. Some losses aren't meant to be overcome, only carried together. And some bonds never need to be spoken aloud, yet they can still pull a person back from the longest silence of their life. If this story touched you, share it with someone who also believes in unconditional loyalty and in the invisible threads that tie humans and dogs together. And if you want to keep walking alongside stories like this, of friendship, loyalty, and quiet lives that run deeper than they seem, hit subscribe to Dog Stories. Your support means the world to us. We don't just tell stories to be heard, we tell them to be felt. Because sometimes, the quietest heroes walk on four legs. Thank you for being part of Dog Stories.